Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I stared death in the face when I was just 3 years old. Old enough to grasp what was happening. Old enough to be afraid. But far too young to do anything about it. I was trapped. Absolutely helpless. And it's only by the grace of God and one unlikely person that I'm alive to write this story. My mom was an avid runner. She ran marathons before she got pregnant with me, then slowed down and stuck to 5Ks. I'm told she ran 3 of those during her pregnancy. Dad says after I was born, she barely waited for the doctor's okay before she started running again. Every fitness-enthused parent knows how difficult it can be to find time for exercise when you have a small child to look after. You have to find shortcuts and workarounds that will allow you to put in the work. For my mom, the solution came as a 3-wheeled stroller designed for running. She started taking me out in the thing every single day. That's what Dad says anyway. I only have one memory of going out in that stroller, and it's of the day I wish I could forget, but probably never will. My therapist agrees that the memory will likely be with me forever, and says I can only affect my relationship with the memory. She recommended writing the story down as a way to take control of the memory and the feelings it brings up. She says channeling the images and sounds and feelings into a narrative will help me make sense of them and come to grips with what happened. I don't think she's right, but I figured it can't hurt to try. And if it doesn't work, hopefully I'll at least provide you with a voyeuristic escape for a few minutes. Enjoy my pain. There's plenty to go around. So like I said, I was 3 when it happened. It was November 7th, 2002, and as cold as any November day can be. My mom got me bundled up in a wool hat and gloves, plus my plushy winter coat that pushed my arms out at a funny angle unless I forced them down. Once my winter boots were on my feet and laced, she picked me up and put me in the jogging stroller. This one had a 5-point harness like a car seat. 2 straps went over my shoulders and 2 more wrapped around my waist. All of the straps clipped into a single clasp just below my belly button. Mom had already put her thermal running apparel on, so once I was all strapped in, we were off. The air bit at my cheeks despite the visor Mom had lowered in front of my face. I watched the houses go by through watery eyes and hoped she wasn't planning on being out for long. Before you start thinking my mom was cruel to take me out like that, I should clarify that I don't remember her even being out for too long when it was cold. Still, as a little kid with no control over what was happening to me, not knowing when we would be back and warm made me nervous. And on that day, I was right to be nervous. The passing houses started getting farther and farther apart as we approached the park. Mom turned around in the park. She would run through the parking lot, past the playground and into the woods where a very nice concrete path would take us on a loop through the trees and spit us back out in the parking lot again to go home. Dad explained all that to me later on, otherwise I wouldn't have remembered it. He says the only thing that could keep Mom from finishing her lap around the park was snow and ice on the path. It hadn't snowed in a while. Any snow or ice that had been covering the path had melted away, so into the woods we went. Mom loved running through those woods. It makes me sad to think about how excited she must have been to see the path clear that day. I bet it made her day, right before it ended her life. We had just made it to the bend where the path curved around to take us back out when the stroller jerked abruptly. The sound of my mom screaming gibberish is burned into my memory, along with the sounds of metal creaking and the stroller's fabric rustling all around my ears. First, it spun sharply to one side, then tipped halfway over as it straightened out. Then I heard a deep, beastly growl, and the stroller was jerked to the side again. My mother's frantic voice started to grow distant as I rolled toward the edge of the path. I had no idea what was happening. I was already in tears when the stroller's front wheel went over the edge of the concrete and got lodged next to a tree root. The abrupt interruption of the stroller's momentum caused the whole thing to tip over and land heavily on one side. I could still hear my mom for, I'm not really sure how long, to be honest. It felt like forever hearing her scream off in the distance as she fought. I flailed against the harness, but it held me firmly in place. I couldn't reach the ground. I was suspended by the straps, barely still in the seat, but totally unable to get out. Something cut my mom's voice off short, and the world around me went quiet. All I could hear was the cutting wind rustling the dead branches above me and the fabric all around my ears. My tears and snot started to freeze. The streams coming down from my eyes felt like deep scratches clawed into my face. They cut across my face at an angle as I struggled to keep my head up. I remember desperately trying to push the button that would release all 4 straps at once, but I couldn't push hard enough with the puffy gloves on my hand. I tried and cried. I even kicked at the ground in a fruitless attempt to right the stroller. What good that would have done, I have no idea, but I was so scared just laying there, trapped, on my side. I wanted to get out so I could go find Mom. I wanted her to be okay. I wanted the fact that she wasn't screaming anymore meant the danger had passed. Looking back, the very fact that she wasn't there picking me up and getting me somewhere warm should have told me the truth. But in that moment, my infantile mind hadn't even considered the possibility that Mom was gone. I had recently been potty trained, so instead of a diaper, I was wearing underwear. The transition had made me so proud, but stuck in that stroller, it became yet another horrible discomfort. I wet myself either out of fear or simply because I had to go and couldn't do it anywhere else. I don't really remember. But I do remember how it felt when my crotch and legs froze like my face had. I'm not sure what finally triggered the first thought about what could have happened to my mom, but I clearly remember thinking it must have been a monster. A terrible creature had come out of the trees and taken her away to eat her. I was sure of it. And as I became certain my mother had been eaten up by the monster, I became equally certain I was next. I forced myself to stop crying, worried the monster might hear me. Instead, I started fidgeting with the harness again. My fingers slipped against the cold plastic as I tried again and again to press the release button. I realized I would never be able to press it with my gloves on, not at all thinking ahead to what would happen to my fingers if they weren't protected from the cold. I ripped my gloves off and dropped them onto the ground in front of me. Maybe I thought I would be able to reach them, but I couldn't. I might as well have thrown them into the trees. My fingers were already partially numb despite the gloves, and without them I quickly began to lose feeling in my digits. All of my struggling and rustling in my coat must have generated enough noise to get the monster's attention. I heard a twig snap somewhere behind me. It echoed sharply through the frigid air, bouncing off of leafless trees, passing through dead shrubbery. Another footstep crushed a few frozen leaves. I froze too. Mom had tried teaching me to hold my breath at the pool that summer, and I had failed miserably, but in that moment, with the monster creeping towards my overturned stroller, I held my breath without even realizing it. More tears came despite my efforts, melting the previous streaks before freezing into new ones. I wanted to call out for Mom, but I still felt it was important to be quiet. As the footsteps continued to creep nearer, I renewed my effort to get free. I was going to get myself out of the stroller and run away. At the very least, I would hide somewhere the monster couldn't find me. I pressed my numb fingers into the button, but still couldn't push it down. Everything was working against me. The button itself was as stiff and cold as my fingers, which felt like they might break off if I pushed them any harder. Every time I pushed, the harness pressed into the ice in my pants too, which only added to the misery. It was about at this point that I tried reaching for my gloves and discovered the ground was out of reach. My neck was getting tired too. I had been holding my head up for so long, and now my frozen muscles were giving up on me. I was ready to give up too. The footsteps had almost reached me. I could hear heavy breathing coming with them. It was deep and loud. The monster was panting like an excited dog. It was excited, I assumed, because it was about to eat me. The footsteps stopped right behind the stroller. I squeezed my eyes shut and whimpered helplessly as the monster grabbed the stroller, set it upright, and turned it around. Then I felt the familiar sensation of rolling down the path. I opened one eye, terrified I was about to see the monster that had taken my mom, but instead saw the empty woods and the path coming towards me, then disappearing behind as I was pushed along. I opened both eyes now and searched the trees frantically for any sign of Mom. I wonder now, as an adult, if I would have ever noticed the scuffs in the mud, the blood on the trees, or in the small patches of snow, or any other sign of her struggle if I had seen them. I was just a kid. I had no idea what to look for. I just wanted my mom. The monster pushed me along, presumably taking me to its cave or lair to eat me, and I started to cry. Not just silent tears this time. I sobbed loudly and uncontrollably. I was shivering with the cold and pure terror. I wet myself again. The monster growled angrily behind me, and I tried to stifle my cries. Soon the playground came into view. Something about the familiar sight gave me a little hope. I half expected Mom to be waiting at the other end of the trail where the loop ended. But of course she wasn't there. With a hideous grunt, the monster shoved the stroller. I rolled forward so hard and erratically that I thought the thing would tip over again, but it stayed upright. I quickly slowed to a stop. The front wheel must have been slightly crooked when the stroller came to rest, because when it stopped, it turned sharply to the left, spinning almost 180 degrees around. That was how I got my first glimpse of the monster. It was enormous, both tall and broad. It stood on two legs and walked with long steps. It had a mane like a lion that wrapped all the way around its face, though the very top of its head was bald. Its thick torso was dark brown with hair far shorter than the hair around its head, and its legs were black and hairless. It lumbered back into the woods without looking back at me. I sat there alone in that parking lot for God knows how long. By instinct, I tucked my unprotected hands under my thighs. Eventually, I fell asleep. I almost didn't wake up. When I finally did awake, I was in a hospital. I didn't recognize any of the people standing around me, but they seemed very happy when I opened my eyes. They asked me a bunch of questions, including my name and my parents' names. Thankfully, my parents had taught me our last name, and I was able to give it to the doctors. I told them my dad's name, but explained that my mom had been eaten by a monster. That was when I had noticed a police officer who was also in the room. She had been standing in the corner but stepped forward as soon as I mentioned the monster. While we waited for my dad to come, I told her all about the big hairy beast that had taken my mom. She wrote down my whole story, which I'm sure did not come out in a fluent narrative. She put it all down in her little notebook, pausing occasionally to give me a comforting smile. Dad took me home that night. He seemed overjoyed when he first saw me, but then he got sad for a long time. I don't think I saw him smile again for months. I probably didn't smile either. Dad explained to me that Mom wasn't ever going to come home again. I told him I knew that, because the monster had eaten her. And he said no, she hadn't been eaten. I asked him if the monster hadn't eaten her, what had it done with her? Dad said the monster sent Mom to heaven. I didn't understand that. Why would an evil monster take somebody to somewhere amazing like heaven? Well, that's the story as I remember it. I'm not sure if my therapist was right. I don't really feel any different. I guess it didn't hurt though. And it probably won't hurt to tell you a little more, I guess. Consider this the epilogue to my traumatic experience. After that initial conversation with my dad, I honestly didn't question what had happened to my mom for years. The next time I thought about it was the second time I saw the monster. I was 7 years old then, and I didn't recognize the beast at first. He was on TV. He walked onto the screen in orange clothes and handcuffs. Dad started crying and turned the TV up. I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "That's the guy that killed your mom." Now much older, I was finally able to make sense of what I had seen that day. The killer wasn't a monster in the sense I had originally thought. He was a big man with long, mangy brown hair and a thick beard that reached his chest. The short fur on his torso must have been a coat, and the baldness I had perceived was actually a hat. As he walked across the screen, the news lady talked about him. She said he was going to serve 4 life sentences. I asked Dad how someone could stay in prison for 4 lives, and he explained that just meant there was almost no chance of the man getting let out before he died. As an adult, I've come to understand the case in much fuller detail. I've learned all about my mother's killer. He's still alive. He's made many appeals, all of which have thankfully been denied. I do believe he will die in prison, which I personally feel is a gift he doesn't deserve. However, I am a little conflicted. This man, this monster, despite the horrific things he did to my mother and 3 other women, saved me. My therapist has tried to reason with me about this, reminding me that the monster put me in the deadly situation in the first place. But I still can't get my head around it. I'll never know why. And I'll never be able to shake the feeling that I am only alive because the monster let me live. The tent's canvas door flapped open, and Rena came barging through, her pug face more puggy than usual.
"Well, Sergeant Avery?"
She drawled in that annoying Midwest twang of hers.
"I saw it again. Same as before, like I told you."
Her superior, Staff Sergeant John Avery, regarded her with a petulant eye, then reached across the card table they had been using as their entertainment center and paused the DVD he had on. A special 25th anniversary edition of The Breakfast Club. "And," he said, oddly working his tongue at a sliver of chicken caught in his teeth, "did you check it out like I said?" 60 minutes earlier, during her hourly foot patrol of the exercise grounds, she'd claimed to have seen something weird within the skeleton of the mess hall tent. An unusual sort of light, like someone with a jittery hand shining a flashlight on the ground. No one was there. Convinced it was just a late hour and desolate setting messing with her head, Avery told her not to worry about it. It was obviously just her imagination fucking with her. If, however, she did happen to see it again, he advised her to Scooby-Doo it, a reference he had to explain in more detail, which both irritated and depressed him. Rena folded her arms across her chest.
I was kinda hoping you'd come with me.
Aw, little Rena's scared of the big bad imaginary white?
It ain't imaginary, Sergeant Avery.
Rena fired back.
And I ain't scared. I'd just rather not check it out alone is all.
Avery smiled thinly at her. When his section chief informed him he had been selected as the night NCO for the build-up phase of the exercise, babysitting all the expensive equipment housed in various communication tents, he had had hopes of being paired up with someone cool, like a dude with an Xbox or a decent-looking chick. What he got instead was Airman Christine Rena, a nerdy pug-faced redhead from Iowa who loved country music and the Twilight series. On the positive side, she was a hard worker and didn't mind doing the security rounds, which made his life a whole lot easier. "Fine," he said, getting up. "Show me." They pushed their way through the canvas door and were immediately greeted by the glare of 2 flood lamps they had set up to illuminate the area around their tent, which served as the main communications tent. Rena started to say something but was drowned out by the rumble of generators and cooling units. Avery motioned for her to zip it, and together they walked out past the flood lamps, where it was less noisy. 20 or so paces onward they stopped, and Avery panned about Camp Zero, the large tent-studded field on the western side of Mitchell Air Force Base where all of the base's war games were played. The object of Rena's angst, the partially erected mess hall, sat in the middle of it all, perhaps 50 yards away, its silhouette barely visible under the soft glow of the moon. "So," Avery said, pointing to the structure. "There?"
Yes.
"And you saw a light, what, sort of moving around on the ground?"
Affirmative.
Avery squinted. "I don't see anything."
"Well,"
Rena huffed.
"it ain't happening right now."
"Of course not," Avery muttered. Then, adopting his best Shaggy voice, he said,
"Okay, Scoob, what do you say we go and take a look-see? It's the mess hall. Maybe there's snacks."
Rena's face bunched up like a raisin.
Huh?
"Snacks," Avery repeated. "'Cause Shaggy and Scooby are always hungry and... Christ, never fucking mind, come on." Removing his flashlight from his web belt and shining it ahead, Avery meandered through the dark to the skeletal structure. Rena, with her own flashlight at the ready, straggled close behind. When they got to the structure's outer framing, Avery paused and had another look. "Still nothing," he said. Rena kept going, moving inside the assemblage of 2x4s. She halted at the very center and looked down.
Here's where I saw it. It was moving in a funny pattern like this.
She moved her beam along the ground in a figure-8 pattern. After a moment, she stopped and went down on her haunches. "What's up, Scoob?" Avery said. "Find a clue?"
Quit calling me that, dang it.
Rena growled at him. She immediately seemed to realize the inappropriateness of her tone and quickly added,
And yes, sir, I did. Look.
Avery bridled at the "sir" bit, not because he was an NCO and the officers were supposed to be the sirs, but because he was 34 and losing his hair, and being called sir made him feel old. "Okay," he grumbled, taking a knee beside her. "What do we got?" Rena pointed at the spot of grass directly in front of her, which Avery saw was a sooty black color instead of the normal green. Puzzled, he put his hand out and waved it over the blackened area. "Warm," he said with a frown.
Yeah,
Rena agreed.
like someone lit a fire here.
"Then put it out right before we left the tent." Avery was about to tack on, except there's no smoke rising from it. but opted to hold on to that little nugget for the time being.
But who?
Inquired Rena.
You think maybe someone's screwing around with us?
Avery arched his eyebrows and gave it some thought. Actually, he said, nodding, there are a couple of knuckleheads in the squadron I wouldn't put it past.
Really?
Oh yeah. Off the top of my head, let's see, there's Rogers from Core Services, Collins from Maintenance Control, and Martell from SATCOM. Avery rubbed his chin. If I was a betting man, though, I'd put my money on Martell. Rena scrunched her nose.
How come? He seems so nice.
Oh, he's one of the nicest people around, but he's also one of the most devious people you'll ever meet. Being so new, you wouldn't know, but Martell is kinda notorious around base for his prank pulling. Avery shook his head. And as it stands, he still owes me for this thing I did back in January. A glint of intrigue sparkled in Rena's eyes.
Why? What'd you do?
The old frozen hat trick, Avery said, chuckling. When he saw Rena had no clue what he was talking about, he elaborated. I took his OCP cap, soaked it in his office's fish tank, then threw it in the break room's freezer. It worked out perfectly, too. He'd brought his lunch that day and hadn't bothered to look for it until it was time to go home. Rena smiled.
It must have been frozen solid. He had to be pissed.
Correct on both accounts. The way I heard it, though, he didn't say anything. Just grabbed it, sat it on top of his head, and wore it all the way out to his car. It was snowing then, and you know how far away we have to park sometimes. The parking lot for their squadron was a massive plot of concrete, shared by 5 other squadrons, and unless you got lucky, it was tough to get a spot any closer than a 10-minute walk away.
Pretty mean, Sergeant Avery.
Rena said, standing.
But funny.
It's funny because it's mean, Avery corrected. Snickering, Rena glanced down at the burnt grass.
So, you really think this is him? Sure took his sweet time getting you back, didn't he?
Told you he's devious, Avery replied, getting to his feet. And yes, I'm sure this here is 100% his doing. Rena scanned the shadow-wrapped exercise grounds.
What should we do then?
Avery shrugged. Nothing. Business as usual until I come up with something better. For now, let's just head back inside. I could do with another cup of coffee, and there's that rematch you owe me. Earlier in the shift, he had challenged her to a game of chess, and she had mopped the floor with him, something he was sure was a fluke, even after she admitted to having been captain of her chess club in high school. Rena turned her flashlight off. She seemed relieved to have an answer about the light.
Your funeral,
she said, and together they started back toward the main communications tent. Rena gazed across the chessboard at Avery, her fingers tapping impatiently on the card table. Avery ignored her, choosing instead to focus on the unfortunate pickle he had gotten himself into.
Any day now,
Rena prompted. Avery grumbled. With his king backed into a corner, and her queen, rook, and knight threatening, it appeared she had him licked again. Grudgingly, he conceded victory.
Best 4 of 7?
Rena offered. Avery rubbed his eyes in aggravation. Nah, he said. Kind of getting bored of this game. He checked his watch. It was almost 4. Besides, it's time for rounds, smarty pants. Rena grinned as she got up and pushed in her chair.
Gladly,
she said. When she got to the flap door, she peered back at Avery.
Wait, what about the prank thingy? You come up with any ideas?
Yep, Avery said. No changes. We stick to our routine. Rena's grin disappeared.
That's your big plan?
It is. Think about it. If Martell is still out there screwing with us, then the joke's actually on him. Remember, he's playing in the exercise too. He's got to be out there like everyone else in a few hours to help with the build-up. And then the scenarios kick off around noon. It's supposed to be in the high 90s tomorrow. He'll be dead on his feet by 10. Avery met Rena's eyes. All the same, watch out for any booby traps when you go out.
Booby traps?
No pranky type stuff, Avery clarified, waving her out. Now shoo. When she was gone, Avery turned his attention to the small LCD TV and DVD player sitting on the card table. He fired up the TV and unpaused The Breakfast Club. The movie resumed where he had last left off, the lunch scene. Ali Sheedy making a Captain Crunch and Pixie Stick sandwich, Emilio Estevez unpacking his giant brown bag feast, Judd Nelson questioning Molly Ringwald on the wiseness of eating sushi, Anthony Michael Hall with his peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off. The Breakfast Club had a special place in Avery's heart. Watching it always reminded him of the 80s, of mongoose bikes and Air Jordan sneakers, of Bruce Springsteen with a bandana sticking out his back pocket, and Michael Jackson with a sparkly white glove, of playing the Pepsi Challenge at the mall and watching MTV when it still showed music videos. More than anything, though, it reminded him of a time when his mother could still remember who he was, back before the EMS crisscrossed her brain with its life-sapping scars. On the screen, a close-up of Ali Sheedy's hair-draped face appeared. Avery paused the DVD there and stared at the image. His mother had a look a lot like Ali Sheedy. He supposed this was another reason he liked the film so much. Careful not to let his gaze linger, the nostalgia he felt was nice, but it also tended to elicit some of his darker memories, like having to watch his mother gradually lose her motor function, listening to her cry as he and his father checked her into that specialized living facility, and of course her death 3 years later. Avery moved his finger to the play button and got the DVD going again. 15 minutes later, a nagging feeling drew his eyes from the screen to his watch. According to it, Rena had been gone twice the amount of time it usually took to complete her rounds. He supposed she might have decided to take a potty break, but something in his gut told him something fishier was afoot. "Martell," he groused, stopping the movie. As soon as he did, a strange noise cut through the night, rising over the clatter of the generators and coolers. Avery started at the sound, which brought to mind those weird shrieks that red foxes back home in Kentucky sometimes made. Only this sound seemed human to him. "Rena," he said, somehow certain it had come from her. The notion drove him out of his seat to the flap door. What, he wondered, could Martell possibly have done to provoke such fear in a grown woman, no less? And further, what did the old boy have in store for him when he went gallivanting out there? Mulling the endless possibilities, Avery readied his flashlight and prepared himself to find out. He figured if he was fast enough, maybe he'd get lucky and spoil whatever Martell had planned. And if not, then screw it. At least he'd get the whole pranking business over with. "All right," he said, and slipped through the flap. Crouching low, he scurried out past the flood lamps and took quick stock of his dark surroundings. The only thing of note he glimpsed was a soft glow coming from the ground within the mess hall structure, right about where he and Rena had discovered the burnt grass. "Go figure," he said, skulking towards it. When he reached the structure, he saw right away that the spot of burnt grass had gotten bigger, easily tripling in size. It was glossier now, more liquidy, like a puddle filled with a luminescent kind of oil. Avery shined his light on it, mystified. When he moved his beam along its leftmost edge, he noticed something was sticking out of the oil. A stout, lumpy mass covered in camouflage. Avery moved closer, and it dawned on him what he was looking at. Rena, laying on her belly with her head and arms submerged in the puddle. "Jesus Christ," he said, thinking that this was a prank. It was the best one he had ever seen, by a long shot. He had no sooner thought this when Rena's body started to convulse wildly, flaying and thrashing as if it was in the grips of a powerful seizure. Avery jumped back at the movement but kept his light trained on her thrashing body. She convulsed for another few seconds before going limp. "Christine," Avery murmured, certain now this was no prank. The girl's body thrashed once more, dislodging itself from the puddle. A beat later, she twisted around and sat bolt upright. Curiously, none of the puddle's oily stuff stuck to her. Avery moved his beam to her face, which was red and blistered, as were her arms and hands. Avery was just about to utter her name again when Rena's head jerked in his direction, and her eyelids popped open, revealing a pair of glassy swimming orbs. After drifting aimlessly for a bit, they settled on Avery, and her jaw dropped open, hanging lower than it should have, as if the mandible had come unhinged. From it a low, keening noise issued, while blood trickled off her bottom lip onto her lap. Aghast, Avery backed up a couple more paces. Rena countered his retreat by standing up in an awkward, unnatural manner. First her hands jerked outwards, slammed onto the ground, and locked straight like support beams. Then her feet drew back and her hips thrust upward in a hard bucking motion, propelling her into a standing position. Once upright, she lingered briefly, swaying like a tree in high winds. After several back and forth, she went still and keened some more.
Rena,
Avery mewed, his voice faltering.
what is this? What happened?
A fresh rivulet of blood leapt from the girl's mouth. She moaned and started taking jerky, shambling steps towards him. As much as Avery wanted to know what was going on, his instincts told him to turn tail and call for help, which was exactly what he did. Knowing there was an operational bank of secure telephones at the rear of the main communications tent, he fled back inside and hastened to the phones. He picked one at random and hammered out the number for base security. A security forces technical sergeant named Diaz answered on the second ring. Avery spoke fast.
This is Staff Sergeant John Avery over at Camp Zero. I'm the night NCO here, and something's happened. I can't explain what, but the airman with me, Airman Rena, is injured and I need an ambulance. What? No, man, this is real world. The exercise doesn't even start until... All right. Thanks. Ow.
A bead of sweat ran down his forehead into his eye. As he wiped it away, he heard the sound of canvas rustling behind him. He turned and saw Rena staggering through the flap door. When she passed under the tent's fluorescent lights, Avery realized her injuries were more extensive than he first thought. The skin covering her face, neck, and part of her arms was mottled and bubbly like overcooked pizza, and a piece of her jawbone poked through her cheek. Crimson tears oozed from the wound, and red frost seeped from her mouth. She ambled past the card table and down the tent's central aisle. Her movements were still jerky and jittery, but markedly less so than before. Watching her approach, Avery was reminded of a toddler still getting comfortable with their newfound ability to walk. He glanced right and left, seeking an escape route, but found himself closed in by racks of equipment. If he wanted out, he was going to have to go through Rena.
Just stop there, Christine, he said. Listen, you're hurt, bad by the looks of it. You need to sit down until help arrives. I don't know what that thing out there did to you, but we'll figure it out. I called the BDOC. Security forces will be here real soon.
Seeming not to hear, Rena kept coming and coming, her stagger slow and purposeful. More gurgles bubbled from her gaping maw, these coming in long strings. Avery had the impression she was trying to say something. When she closed within 5 feet, Avery snatched a heavy technical manual from one of the shelves to his left and wielded it like a weapon. He repeated his demand for her to stop, but she paid no heed. When she got within arm's length, he said he was sorry and belted her across the head. The blow sent her reeling against a rack of encryption devices to his right. He thought she might go down, but somehow she managed to wheel back around and grab his arm. Avery fought to break free, but Rena merely tightened her grip.
Let go!
He shouted. Her swimming eyes locked on his. Instead of letting go, she cast him face first into the bank of secure telephones behind them. His forehead caught the corner of one of the metal shelves, and the darkness leapt up, swallowing him whole. Sirens blared somewhere in the distance. Avery blinked open his eyes and found himself staring up at the stars. His face was hot, and a smell like burnt plastic filled his nostrils. Confused, he craned his neck to get his bearings and saw that he was lying on his back beside the oil puddle.
No,
he said, and tried to get up. A pair of hands came flying out of the darkness as he did. They landed on his head, gripping it hard, and thrust it into the puddle. Avery screamed, and a tremendous voltaic jolt rippled through his brain. Everything went bright white, and his mind became infused with the wails of a billion beings trapped in eternity. Amid the wails, something not quite solid grasped his face and tore open his jaw. There was no pain in the act, just a vague popping sensation and the notion of something rushing into his throat. Next, he knew his essence was being pushed into a small corner of his brain, and felt something very old and angry permeating the rest of his gray matter, with parts of it exploring the areas he had never used. Whatever it was, it spoke to him in the language of neurons, and in the matter of milliseconds explained its race's long, tragic story. Avery communicated that he understood its plight, especially the anguish and loss of its own parent figures, and agreed to sleep indefinitely so it might use his body. It thanked him, and then all at once he was dreaming. The inhabitant of Rena's body moved away from the fissure and gazed at the pair of armored monsters with the revolving lights which had just approached. The monsters went still for a moment, then broke open, and two organic creatures emerged. The creatures brandished archaic weapons and made vocalizations that the inhabitant was on the verge of understanding. Studying the armed creatures, the inhabitant considered how very lucky its species had been. After all those millennia spent scratching and digging at the walls of the wretched singularity, they could have emerged anywhere in the universe. A dead planet, a lifeless moon, an imploding star, or more likely the infinite depths of space. But somehow their sage's calculations had pushed them through the fissure here on this flourishing world, which not only had a sustainable atmosphere but sentient, inhabitable life forms. It was far more than their species could have ever hoped for. Even more providential was the fact that these sentient life forms were not undeveloped. They had speech and weaponry, which meant they were somewhat evolved and probably had achieved some measure of technological advancement. This was good because it would require the inhabitant species less time to build the gateways necessary to return to their home world and retake it from the vile invaders which had killed most of their population and banished the rest to the singularity. Avery's soon body rose from the fissure, newly inhabited, and shuffled to where Rena's inhabitant stood. Another armored monster announced its arrival with bright lights and loud screams. Rena's inhabitant also deemed this beneficial to its needs. Only two of its kind had escaped the fissure so far, and there were many more waiting for their freedom. Since that freedom required the inhabitant a viable host, the more of these creatures that came, the better. The two armed creatures stayed where they were while the two different ones bearing some sort of container instead of weapons came nearer, emitting more vocalizations. The inhabitants of Rena and Avery communicated with each other through gurgles and moved back towards the fissure. When the creatures were within a couple of paces, Rena's inhabitant articulated one of the words it had learned from picking through Rena's brain.
Sorry,
it said, brimming with the corporeal strength it hadn't known for eons. And then it attacked.
Peter? Oh, Peter. It's time to wake up, sleepyhead. The quiet voice drifted through the blackness of the small enclosure, like a fall leaf looking for a place to land. Peter lay sprawled across a concrete floor. His eyelids fluttered as the sing-songy voice pulled him back to consciousness. With great effort, he pushed up until he was leaning on one elbow. He was surrounded by nothingness. The pain in his head was sharp and intense. It felt like someone was trying to break out of his skull with a jackhammer. What's going on? He asked, his speech slurred. He was woozy and confused, as if he'd been drugged. He vaguely remembered walking to his car after work. Something had covered his face. A rag? It had a strong medicinal smell, and then... what? Gentle, upbeat music began to fill the lightless room. It had a bouncy rhythm, a childlike quality. A brief intro was followed by a chorus of small children singing gleefully. Good morning, let's all get up and sing. Shake those webs out of your head and dance and play and sing. Oh, good morning, it's time to move along. With a do-dilly-dee and a do-dilly-do, it's our good morning song. The tune ended with an abrupt thump. Peter continued to lean against the floor. What was that? Are there children here? Well, look who's finally up. Welcome, Peter. The voice was not insistent or urgent. It nudged rather than pushed. Please, take a few moments to acclimate yourself. Peter heaved himself up to a crooked sitting position. He had no sense of time or location. The lack of light clouded his perception. His head swayed as he attempted to make out his surroundings, but his eyes proved useless. As he continued to pull in deep breaths of air, he gradually became more lucid. When his situation became clear to him, Peter hyperventilated. His intense fear of the dark seized control of his mind and body. He was cloaked in impenetrable darkness. His terrified mind drew vivid pictures of phantom tendrils reaching out for him. They pulled him down into a pit with a withered ghoul whose hands could reach out at any time and drag its cracked fingernails down his naked arm. His neck muscles stiffened and tingled as he thought of the thing's hot, putrid breath caressing his neck, lingering there like a sticky web. His instinctive need to escape overwhelmed him to the point of incoherence. He hoped it was all a nightmare, something that would evaporate once the lights came on. But he knew this was real. It was happening. He could feel the unforgiving floor beneath his quivering body. He managed to stand upright, nearly slipping. White dots danced before his eyes, and sickness churned in his belly. Despite his alarm, he did not shout for help. That's the thing about the dark. I could be anywhere. Am I alone? Is there someone else in here with me? He thought of addressing the unsettling voice, but he also wondered what he might draw forth from the inky expanse. He felt caught between needing to know what was happening and fearing the answer. The floating voice again penetrated the void, as if divining Peter's concerns. Hello again, Peter. Now that you've had ample time to adjust, tell me, are you scared? Do you find yourself alone in the shadows, or are others standing near you? I can hear your frantic breathing. I can feel your heartbeat through the walls. Would you care to know where you are? Or are you afraid to be told that you've died and fallen into the deepest hole in hell? Maybe you're wondering if this is a place where you can escape or, hopefully, be rescued. Talk to me, Peter. Your questions pose no danger to you. Where am I? Not as far away as your imagination and distress might be telling you. You're within 10 miles of your office, and you might be relieved to learn that you're not in some large, abandoned warehouse. The room you're in only measures 14 by 10, probably the size of your bedroom. This is a place that you likely drive by every day on your way to work and never notice it. Probably no one else does either. Why am I here? Why have I been kidnapped? Why not you, Peter? Is your life any more or less important than someone else's? But I haven't done anything. What are you going to do to me? I'm going to offer you an opportunity to free yourself. How? How am I going to free myself? With something small yet important. Something necessary for your survival. Such as? A key. Well, not so much a key as the key. Key to what? Isn't it obvious? The key to the door. You do want to get out, don't you? And no, I won't track you down or harm you. Your escape comes with no consequences. All you have to do is move around the room and find that key. It shouldn't be too difficult. The room is empty. Now, keep in mind, it could be anywhere. It might be hanging on a wall, dangling from the ceiling, or lying on the floor. Who knows? Once you find it, all you have to do is feel your way to the door, unlock it, and step into the glorious sunlight. Peter restrained his optimism. There had to be a catch. There was always a catch. You're leaving something out, aren't you? There's something you want. Tell me what's in this for you. You got me, Peter. It doesn't mean much if it's not challenging. It's okay, though. You're going to do fine. Just tell me what I have to do. With you is a small wooden box. Feel around the floor and let me know when you find it. And if I refuse? Then my efforts to lead you toward a solution to your dire circumstances will be moot. The threat was clear, so he stooped and began groping around. His fingertips pushed against something hard. Peter felt the rectangular object, determined that it was the hidden box, and picked it up. Okay, I found it, he said. Well, that's very good, Peter. You're one step closer to home. Now then, you'll feel a lid on top of the box. Lay the box back down on the floor and remove it. Then stand up quickly and take a few steps back. Peter complied. He heard a faint scraping noise and something light hitting the floor. 2 more puzzling sounds followed. Then he detected some faint scuttling. Soon after, something crawled over his shoe. He gasped, lifted his foot, and propelled whatever it was across the room. What was in that box? Peter, listen to me carefully. There are 3 sizable and highly venomous black fat-tailed scorpions in the room with you. In the Middle East and parts of Africa, they are known as man-killers. Now, Peter, you have to be careful here. They're nocturnal, so they thrive in the dark. They can climb rough walls, such as the brick ones in your room. They can crawl across a ceiling and drop down on you. Like all good hunters, they hide and wait patiently for their prey to wander along. As you search for the key, you'll want to tread lightly. They can sense vibrations. Their venom is fast-acting. The immediate symptoms of being stung are swift, painful, and horrific. Without prompt medical care, you won't survive. Do you understand what I've just told you? Peter stood, petrified and mute. Peter, do you understand? Yes, he croaked. Marvelous. It's now officially you against the Scorpions. I hope you crush it. I mean that literally and figuratively. I'll be watching all the action via an infrared camera. How do I know you won't kill me anyway? I said I wouldn't, but I've never had to think about it before. No one has escaped yet. For now, you're the next contestant. Good luck, Peter. Wait, just let me out of here. I haven't seen you. I can pull together some money. Okay, not a lot, but enough to make it worth your while. Silence. Hey, come on! Don't just leave me here. Please. Please. Silence. Peter exhaled. His teeth chattered and his body trembled. Lightless room, poisonous scorpions, and a blind search for a small key? What could go wrong? Okay, you can do this. Do this, and do this. His first idea was to try his cell phone, but his pocket's lightness indicated it was missing. Then he considered the door. He wondered if it could somehow be forced open. Peter suspected that pounding on it and yelling for help wouldn't do him any good. Lord only knew where he was. He stuck his arms out in the windowless room and stepped forward. Despite trying to remain poised, he felt fear rushing through his veins like a frigid river. His unhelpful mind began conjuring images of dog-sized monstrosities swirling about the room, ready to snare him with oversized pinchers and squeeze him until he was sliced in two. He shuddered as he imagined the excruciating gouge of a gigantic, barbed stinger that would pump gallon after gallon of searing poison into his cracking frame. Knock it off. We don't have time for this now. Just focus on that stupid key so we can get out of here. Once Peter got himself marginally in check, he began moving again. He walked until he came to a wall and then felt his way along until he reached a steel door. It was heavy and dense, like the type used for extra security. Tracing the frame, he discovered the knob and twisted it. Because it moved freely, Peter reasoned that it wasn't the knob securing the door, but some other kind of locking mechanism. He examined further and came across the bulge of a double deadbolt lock. Now he knew what he was dealing with. The key it would have to be. He hoped that his perceptions might be heightened enough to guide him past the scorpions and to the key. He couldn't see the room and its contents, which was an obvious disadvantage, but he remembered hearing that the brain could compensate for a lost sense by enhancing the other faculties. Scorpions. His idea was to start with the floor, then gradually work his way upward. He followed the wall until he felt a corner. Then, he got down on his hands and knees and started crawling, sliding his palms across the floor's surface. Despite his resolve, his desire to find the key began to be hampered by his knowledge that 3 large, deadly scorpions lurked around him. What did I ever do to deserve this? He wandered around for several minutes, then halted when his hand collided with something small and firm. He shot to his feet. Oh, crap. He immediately began stomping around the floor. He heard the unmistakable crunch, followed by the sound of fast tapping, swiftly moving away from him. His body shook as the adrenaline ran its course. Once his nerves settled down, Peter lowered himself again and resumed his search. He glided his hands over the floor's smooth surface, keeping in mind that the other scorpions could be scattered across it. He moved forward in a straight line. When he came to the wall, he made a U-turn. Crawling, unseeing and defenseless, he kept anticipating a sharp sting. His stomach hurt. Once he convinced himself that he had successfully surveyed the entire room, Peter enjoyed a palpable sense of relief. He was about to switch his blind search to the walls when he remembered what the voice had warned. They're capable of climbing. Okay, he mumbled. Easy does it. He prepared himself for the fact that the walls would take longer because, although he could sweep his hands widely over the floor, he would need to traverse the walls in tighter quadrants. Peter started at the lowest point and, with tremoring hands, progressed upward, then over and down again. His palms scraped over something with stiff hairs as he moved down, and he leapt back. He heard the scorpion skittering across the bumpy bricks to his left. Peter knew that he needed to pin down the scorpion's exact location and remove it before he could safely proceed with the wall search. He took off his thin outer shirt, rolled it thickly around his right hand, formed a fist, and then turned it to resemble a crude, fleshy hammer. He systematically began pounding his fist, one blow at a time, against the bricks, listening for movement. After a few hits, he felt a light tugging on the cloth. Next, there came a soft jabbing sensation against the outside of the covering. He continued smashing his padded hand against the wall, hoping the scorpion wouldn't climb over the protective barrier and stab him. Peter's heart was thumping like a 1980s techno beat. He could imagine the creature's fiery needle. He was more disgusted than satisfied when he finally heard the loud crack of its exoskeleton and felt warm fluid squirt onto his exposed wrist. Ugh, he moaned as he wiped away the crushed remains of the scorpion before tossing the shirt aside. Okay, that's 2. Peter finished going over the remaining wall space. He found no trace of the key or its dangerous guardian, so he turned his attention to the ceiling, from where he hoped to find the key suspended from a string. Despite having dispatched 2/3 of the obstacles between him and possible release, Peter was still unnerved. He felt like an inmate sentenced to execution, time and manner of death unknown. But his terror of the dark was considerably greater than his fear of the deadly hunter maneuvering around him, waiting to pounce. His muscles locked, and his staccato breathing was like the desperate pant of a trapped animal. His mind vacillated between breaking out of the black, awful cage and the suffocating horror clinging to him like a blood-soaked shroud. Oh God, is the dark getting thicker? I can't breathe. Peter's chest hitched as he pulled in short gasps of dank air. He used the breathing technique that his psychiatrist had taught him some years back. Breathe in and hold it for 3, 2, 1. Exhale slowly. He repeated the mantra until it had the desired effect. Once he regained a measure of composure, he turned his thoughts back to the key. He began working through logical scenarios. He didn't yet know where the key was, but he now knew where it wasn't. He also knew that the third scorpion hadn't been on the floor or walls, at least not the wall he'd just beaten to a pulp, so it could be somewhere above him, along with the key. He hoped that he'd startled it enough to send it fleeing back down to the floor or a wall, rather than remaining on the ceiling, waiting for its quarry to wander by. "So where are you, you little monster?" As he began advancing, he lifted his arms over his head and made a forward paddling motion with his hands, hoping to graze the hanging key. After a while, he detected some quiet clacking, but the harsh acoustics of the empty room made the sound little more than a soft echo, making it difficult for Peter to establish the scorpion's whereabouts. He shivered at the thought of the hellish creature scurrying up his leg at any second. He paused and lowered his arms. He felt the need to think things through before proceeding. "I can stay still and pray like crazy that help arrives, or I can go for the surer thing and keep looking for the key, assuming there even is one." Peter wondered if anybody had noticed yet that he was missing. He had no idea how long his abductor had imprisoned him. So why, when, or where would the search for him begin and end? His only tangible hope was to find the key. Peter raised his hands high again and resumed searching the room, step by agonizing step. He walked heel to toe until he reached the room's end to maintain as straight a line as possible. He continued to listen for the final attacker. "Please, God, I can't take this much longer." On the one hand, he was discouraged by not finding the key yet. On the other, he was reassured that the waiting scorpion hadn't speared him. He was also becoming impatient. He wanted out now. He picked up the pace and swung his hands out further in front of him. After a couple more wide passes, he bumped into a wall and kicked it in frustration. Peter sensed no air movement, just felt the raw feeling of something dropping onto his head. He shrieked as he felt the scorpion scratching its way across his scalp. In a frenzy, he raked his fingers through his hair, working to dislodge it before it had a chance to strike. His right-hand fingers swept underneath the enraged arachnid, giving his index finger a painful squeeze. Peter yelped and snapped his hand backward, sending the scorpion tumbling down the back of his undershirt. Its tiny leg bristles scraped against his goosebump-dotted skin as it slid slowly down his bare back. At first, its sting felt like little more than a slight needle prick. But as the jab site began to burn with increasing intensity, Peter knew the worst had happened. His heart thumped furiously inside his chest as a primal instinct overtook him, throwing him into a mad fit of desperation. Hoping to kill the scorpion, he ran backward until he collided with one of the walls. He screamed as agonizing pain shot through his swelling back like a white-hot electrical current. Peter groaned in anguish when he felt the sinister thing's spider-like body squirming around at the bottom of his shirt. He grimaced and arched his back as the unharmed scorpion clawed its way upward toward the shirt's entry point, digging its dagger feet in along the way and slamming its stinger against his tender flesh repeatedly, like endless injections of boiling acid. His effort had failed. Feeling his strength waning, Peter hurled himself backward one last time. His nearly limp body crashed heavily against the rigid wall, causing the foul creature's soupy guts to explode through its shattered armor and onto his tortured skin. Then, his legs gave way, and he dropped to the floor in a paralyzed heap. He was sweating profusely, spit oozing from his mouth like a clear syrup. "Help," he whimpered. "Please, help me." He heard the turning of the deadbolt. The door opened, and a vague outline of a person filled the bright opening. Peter's eyelids began to droop. His vision blurred, making it impossible to make out the figure that had entered the room and was now stooping beside him. "Oh, Peter. Oh my goodness." The voice was serene and soothing. "I know you might find this hard to believe, but I truly did want you to figure this out. I'm getting bored with the same old outcome. Why do people have to make everything so complicated? The answer's always the simplest. That's sad, don't you think, Peter? Isn't that sad?" Peter was finding it hard to breathe. The waves of nausea were getting stronger. Tears flowed from his eyes in a salty torrent. He didn't want to end up like this, a crumpled corpse on a filthy floor whose body would never be found by anyone. This is going to kill Mom and Dad. Honestly, Peter, I would have allowed you to walk away. As you observed earlier, you never saw me, and I can always relocate. But here you are. The paralysis has already overtaken you. First your limbs, lungs, and other vital organs. But the good news is the overall pain will lessen to a dull throb. Your heartbeat will slow down, and breathing will become much more difficult. You've got maybe a couple of hours or so, and then your soul, at least, will be free. If there's anything you want to say, you'll need to say it now while you can still talk." "Where?" Peter grunted. "Where's the key? I have to know. Please. Was it in the ceiling?" "Well, after everything you've been through, the least I can do is show you the answer. It's both logical and straightforward. Whenever something goes missing, people tend to look all over their house for it. They turn the whole place inside out. And like them, all of you waste so much time trying to be resourceful that it never occurs to you to begin by searching the one place people eventually find most lost items." The man reached into Peter's front pants pocket and removed a key.
I saw something back in 1990 that has haunted me ever since. We were a Boy Scout troop of 16 boys between the ages of 13 and 17, going on a 2-day hike along a trail that ran 60 miles from Richmond to Marion in Indiana. 3 adults supervised us the entire way. They gathered us up on the north side of town one Friday after school in late September, checked our supplies and gear, then off we marched. Most of the journey that evening followed an old abandoned railroad track through farmers' fields. We managed to reach a small bit of forested area just before it got dark, and we pitched tents there, gathered wood for a fire, and had our meals. After we ate, the grown-ups got out a couple of bags of marshmallows to roast, and we all sat around a fire where people had a chance to tell ghost stories. Many of the tales were the classic urban legends, like one about a woman who stopped at a gas station and found out she had a serial killer hiding in her back seat, and one about 2 kids who parked somewhere late at night and only just barely escaped a mental patient with a hook for a hand. But for his third and final story, the troop leader told us all to get up and follow him. We left the safety of the fire and hiked up the ridge to where the railroad tracks were. He pointed down the line a ways, and we all saw something white in the distance. It was a cross set in the ground just to the side of the track. "See that cross?" he said. "That marks the spot where Jack Hobbs died." "Who was Jack Hobbs?" someone asked. "This line used to connect Cincinnati to Chicago, but legend has it that back in 1909, an eastbound train from Chicago missed a switch point and ended up running head-on into a westbound train up near Muncie. 12 people died, dozens were injured. For years after that, farmers all up and down the line started complaining of hearing a train's whistle blowing in the middle of the night, but there were never any trains supposed to be going through at the times they claimed they heard them. Pretty soon rumor spread that what they were hearing was a ghost train, carrying the souls of those 12 dead people, never getting to their destination, damned forever to ride the rails until the end of time. He paused, and we all stood silently, listening for the sound of a train. Being a skeptic, I expected one of the other adults to sneak up behind us with something, but there was nothing but crickets and wind. After about a minute of unnerving silence, he continued. People started trekking out here from all over the place to try to catch a glimpse of the ghost train. One of those people was a guy by the name of Jack Hobbs. He was some sort of paranormal expert out of New York. He followed the tracks kind of like we're doing. So, as the story goes, Jack Hobbs was following the track, carrying all manner of ghost-catching equipment, when all of a sudden he saw a light come out of nowhere ahead of him on the track, and he heard a train's whistle in the air. The ghost train, he thought. I've actually seen the ghost train. He stood there in awe as the light grew brighter, and the whistle from the train grew louder. Just as he heard the screech of metal as the brakes were hit, he realized too late that he was standing in the path of a very real, very powerful locomotive. The troop leader went quiet again, and almost exactly when he did, a loud train whistle screamed directly behind us, causing us all to jump. As I had expected earlier, one of the other grown-ups had sneaked up behind us to finish the story with a good scare. After we had settled down, we went back to the campsite and got ready to go to sleep. I was partnered with a kid named Sant, who turned out to be a heavy sleeper as well as a loud snorer. I wasn't used to having to share space with someone else, and the story of the ghost train had left me somewhat unnerved, so I found it hard to fall asleep. Then the adults went to bed, putting out the fire, and everything was pitch black and the air was filled with animal noises, and there was no way I was going to get any Z's. I was lying there in my sleeping bag, listening to Sant snore, looking out toward the slope up to the track, when all the hooting owls and chirping crickets and chittering squirrels suddenly went dead quiet. Sant snorted once, rolled over, and stopped snoring. Everything was absolutely silent, and when everything goes silent all of a sudden, my ears try to make up for the lack of sensory input by introducing this never-ending high-pitched sound. Even putting my hands over my ears couldn't drown it out because it was inside my head. When I gave up and uncovered my ears, I heard something else. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. It was very faint. It was coming from somewhere south down the tracks. Shh! Clop! Clop! Something was moving, I realized. Something shifting rocks and leaves as it slowly crept along. I tried to make out where it was coming from, but it was too dark to see anything. An unexplainable cold crept into my sleeping bag, and I started shivering despite several layers of clothing and an additional blanket for warmth. I realized that the cold wasn't really there. It was just my body trying to explain why I was shaking so fiercely. The truth was, I was scared out of my mind, and this was what fear felt like. The moon came out from behind the clouds in the area up by the train tracks, got bathed in its blue light. I stared, straining to make out what was making the sound, but there was nothing visible, just the slow, methodical sound. Shh, clop, clop. Shh, clop, clop. I lay there in my bag and prayed someone else would wake up. A few seconds later, over the ridge, I saw something move. It seemed to rise a couple of inches with each repetition of the sound. Shh, clop, clop, and then back down. It was moving along the train tracks, coming down the line toward the camp, shambling slowly. As it approached, the moonlight made it easier to see. I could distinctly make out someone's head and shoulders. He was marching slowly, eerily along. I thought he must have been walking alongside the rails, on the other side of the slope, but after a minute of his steady gait, he came alongside our camp, and I saw with grim horror what it really was. It was a torso, just the upper half of a man. God is my witness. It was half a person, pulling itself along on its elbows, dragging itself down the railroad track in the direction of that cross we'd been shown. It was barely 10 yards away from me, and the light wasn't that good, but I could make out its ragged, mangled features. Its head was badly mutilated. Hair was missing in clumps. The ear that should have been visible on the side facing me was gone, and there was a deformity to its skull that made it look like a cracked egg. Its arms were bare. The shirt it wore was ragged and torn from what looked like years of dragging itself on its elbows. Every now and then it hefted itself up onto its hands with a low groan. Shh. And I could see sickening bits of its insides hanging out the ripped lower half of its abdomen. Clop, clop. It dropped back down onto its elbows. This thing, this unfathomable wreck of a person, didn't seem to notice our camp, and I lay there shivering in my sleeping bag, praying each second that it would not look my way. Please, God, wake me up. Please, God Almighty, make it go away. It had to be a dream, I thought. This can't exist. Then I heard it speak. Where are they? It was mumbling to itself. Where are they? It just said that over and over as it dragged on down the track and behind some trees out of my sight. I wanted to breathe a sigh of relief, but my heart was still racing, and the air seemed trapped in my chest. I wish I could say that was the end of it. I wish I could say that I passed out, woke up the next morning, and told everybody my story, and they all laughed at me. And to this day, I'll never know if what I saw was real. But Sant woke up. He woke up with a loud snort, rolled over, and not seeing me, fumbled out of his sleeping bag and got up. Sant, I whispered. Sant! But Sant groggily walked past a line of tents and started up the hill to the railroad tracks. I lay there, watching him go, wondering if maybe I'd been dreaming after all, and now, only now, was waking up. Or maybe this thing, this ghost, only showed itself to me to mock my fear? To wave my disbelief in my face? See, we do exist. Sant went past the tracks and down the other side to the point. All I could see was his shoulders and head. From there, he looked much like the shambling thing had looked when I first saw it, and again I was stricken with doubt. I could hear him sigh, and the sound of piss hitting the ground. Then I heard, shh, clop, 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 clop. Before I could even scream, I saw it. The thing, the half a man, moving at a frightening speed on its hands. It destroyed lower half roughly, flying across the ground as it moved. It made the distance from the edge of the trees to where Sant stood in a matter of seconds. And just as it got there, it screamed, "Where are they?" Sant never made a noise. It reached him before he could even look, and the piddling of his urination disappeared in the same instant he did. There was a sound I can't even begin to describe. Then another, like someone was tearing open a burlap sack of potatoes. Finally, a wet splash, followed by something heavy hitting the ground and tumbling down the hill. By then, I didn't need to scream. The moment the thing yelled, several people woke up. Nobody seemed to see where the noise had come from, but they shouted in surprise, and their shouting woke up others. And in less than a minute, the whole troop was awake and trying to find their flashlights. Finally, I unfroze and I started screaming, "Sant! Sant! It got Sant!" Thrashing about in my sleeping bag, trying to get my hands free in order to point. "Everybody stay here. Get a fire going," the troop leader yelled. He and one of the other adults ran up the hill to the tracks and started searching around with their flashlights. Other kids were asking me, "Was it Sant? What got Sant?" And I realized I didn't know what to tell them. Half a man? A ghost? What the hell was I supposed to tell them I saw? So I just did what any 13-year-old would do. Jack Hobbs. It was Jack Hobbs. He was cut in half by the train and crawling on his elbows. Yeah, that went over well with everybody, of course. We heard the other guy that had gone up to the rise with the troop leader suddenly shout, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" And there was a mad scramble as everybody tried to run up to the tracks to see what had happened. The troop leader caught us before the top, red-faced and eyes bulging, and started yelling, "Everybody get back! Everybody get back! Get back to the fire! There might be a bear nearby." "A bear?" somebody asked. "Gather up your gear," the third grown-up ordered. The second adult returned, wiping at his forehead and looking paler than I'd ever seen anyone look before. The three of them held a little meeting together away from the rest of us, while we all huddled around a newly made fire, and I was bombarded with questions about what I had seen. I tried to describe it, but it seemed so surreal that it was almost like waking from a dream where bits and pieces of memory fade before you can describe them. I realized that the more I spent trying to describe it, the more insane I sounded. It was decided that the troop leader and the third grown-up would stay put, while the kids were marched to the nearest farm to find a phone and call the police and our parents. 15 boys between the ages of 13 and 17, numb with fear and horror, guided by a single adult through the dark night along the abandoned railroad tracks until we hit a cornfield and marched nervously and cautiously through tall stalks of corn, trying to keep tabs on each other. The rest of that night was a blur. I barely remember the details of the farmhouse we waited at, the folks who let us come in and use their phone. I don't remember most of Saturday either. I remember my parents picked me up before the sun was up, and I remember talking to a police officer in a uniform about my version of events. I remember drinking a glass of milk and feeling like my stomach was churning. But the timeline of what happened when is jumbled. The official conclusion was that Sant had been mauled by a bear, literally torn in half by it. I didn't get the gritty details, but I've never really wanted them. Honestly, I barely knew him, having only first met him at a troop meeting 3 weeks prior to the hike. I quickly refused to talk about what I had seen. I told too many kids that night that I'd ended up going to school with. Before I even had a chance to really make any friends, I'd become known as the weird kid who saw the bear that killed San and thought it was a ghost. One guy even accused me of being directly responsible for his death. He might have been right. I know what I saw, though. There was no bear. I don't like going camping anymore for obvious reasons. I've tried it, but the few times I managed to handle it long enough to fall asleep, I hear that sound in my dreams. Shh. Clop. Clop. And I inevitably wake up screaming.
Chapter 1. Vernon Hasker sat on the porch swing, which had hung on the front porch of his old and now decaying farmhouse for many years. He had spent many an evening looking at that tree that had started as a small volunteer sapling all those years back. It now was in the process of being reduced to a large disappearing stump, surrounded by sawdust floating in the air. He watched as Carl from Kettner's tree service run the large stump grinder over the oddly shaped wood remnant that was vanishing from sight in a tornado of shooting debris. Finally, that damn fucking eyesore of a memory will be gone for good, he silently thought to himself. Nary a single teardrop escaped from either eye, even though the tree had contributed a lifetime of memories. He wanted to picture the pleasant ones, the recollections from the beginning, like back to the first time he had tripped over the young sapling and almost fell to the ground carrying his newlywed wife through the yard, up the 4 steps of the front porch, and then across the threshold of their newly purchased home. Hell, they were both naked as jaybirds before they ever made it through the French doors of the bedroom. Clothes strewn from the open front door, scattered all the way through the living room. A shoe here, a shirt there, bra and panties on the couch and floor. That goddamn tree had seen it all, and a whole lot more through the years. The old pignut hickory had seen plenty of love, and of course the opposite of such feelings. Arguments, anger, tears brought on by making up. Yes, one would think some of these memories would spur at least the budding of a tear in even the most unhuman of a soul. But not today. Not in Vernon's eye. Old hickories seemed to grow quicker in the beginning, through the good times. There were years when either the weather or maybe the couple's lacking relationship where a slowing seemed to take hold of its growth spurt. But some years, when their relationship was spent copulating like busy rabbits, that goddamn tree seemed to grow several feet higher and thicker through the middle of the night. Of course, Vernon nor May ever seemed to take notice or see the correlation until later, after the event. It was a tragedy of sorts. Mistakes made by both. The perfect storm that seemed to brew slowly but explode with a resounding end. A finale that could not be undone or ever taken back. Vernon's demeanor, nor the expression on his face, ever changed as he sat swinging back and forth, watching the last bits of the old guardian tree be reduced to dust and mulch. Carl Kettner loaded up his stump grinder onto the trailer and then slowly swaggered his way over towards Vernon, who still sat watching as he pulled the glass to his mouth and swallowed. Carl held a small notebook in his hand. Vernon thought it was probably the inflated bill of doing his business on a Saturday. "How much this gonna cost me, Carl?" Vernon asked as he continued slowly swaying back and forth on the swing, not missing so much as a single forward and back motion. His worn-out shoes planted firm on the chipped painted boards as he loosely grasped his tall glass. "Well now, Vernon, being how it's my normal day off and all." Yeah, here comes the screwing. I bet I don't even get another drink for you get me bent over the railing and begin... "Damn it, Vernon, that's just wrong in every sort of the word. I ain't never done you bad before. You know that to be true. Why in hell did you think you needed this work done before a weekday anyway? Damn tree was pert near dead and dang sure wasn't going nowhere on such a nice weekend. I reckon that be my business, Carl, and none of yourn. Just give me the damn bill and I'll get you paid. I'd offer you a lemonade, but you'd just squeeze all the good from the lemons and leave me nothing but the seeds and rind. Vernon stared intently as he reached from his seated position for the piece of paper. Why, you such a bitter old coot, Vernon. It's hotter'n devil on fire, and all you've been doing is watching me sweating my ass off working. Only muscle you moved while I cut up that trunk into pieces was lifting your damned whiskey sour to your lips with a danged old scowl across your face. Vernon slowly got up as he grabbed the swing's chain with his right hand. I done it myself back in the day, Carl. Wait till you turn 65. Ain't no young man can endure the pain I have. His legs wobbled a bit until he got his balance. Carl reached out to steady him, but Vernon swatted his hand away. I'll get your check. You keep your damned hands to yourself. The screen door slapped closed with a whack, and Vernon disappeared into the darkness of another room. Carl leaned against the railing until he fell to give some. He stood up quick and reached down, grabbing it with his hand and shook it. It moved quite a bit, and he shook his head in disdain. He hollered through the screen door. I can sturdy these railings out here before you or someone visiting leans too hard agin it and give away, spilling an ass to front yard and bringing you a lawsuit. A minute or two later, Vernon opened the screen door with a barely legible check in his hand. Don't you go worrying about my business lesson I ask you about it. Nobody got business being here anyway. I don't send out no goddamn invitations to throw parties. Carl took the check and folded it, placing it neatly into his sweat-drenched t-shirt pocket. He wasn't sure he'd even try and cash it. Probably wouldn't clear anyway. He grabbed his waistband with both hands and hiked his jeans up higher before tipping his straw hat to leave. I appreciate you, Vernon. Your company ain't always real pleasant, but I do feel for you all these years after May disappeared on you. Everyone in town has feelings of pity, too. I don't ask for nobody's pity nor thoughts. I asked to get a bothersome tree and stump removed, and you done it. I reckon after I stack it, it'll be all right. Now get on out of here and enjoy the rest of your day off. Carl held out his hand to shake Vernon's, but all it drew was another cold response. What? I didn't pay you enough? I was trying to shake your damned hand, Vernon. Closing our business dealings as good people and friends do. Well, I guess you better save that for your next friend or victim. Good day. Chapter 2. Vernon sat back down and the metal chain holding the swing restarted the same squeaky tune again. With the same blank stare, he watched Carl Kettner's truck and trailer, which held the stump grinder, pull out and make the left turn towards town. He tilted his head back and breathed out a slow, wispy breath as if a truckload of tension leaked from his body. He closed his eyes. His glass of whiskey sour sat on the small wooden table beside him, the ice melting quickly into tepid water and sinking lower than the alcohol in the glass. Another sigh passed across Vernon's lips. You can't haunt me no more now, May. Your cheating memory is buried in the ground along with your rotted corpse. And to think I once loved you with all my heart. His words came out barely more than a whisper. Vernon had slowly whittled the old pig-nut hickory tree limb by limb because the memory of that violent event so long ago kept coming back. Ain't nothing left to amputate no more, May. Old Hickory is dead and gone forever, just like you and your hoeing ways. You can't come back now and show your temptress body and lust-filled eyes to taunt and intimidate me. That tree is as chopped up as your fornicating body is. The pieces of you and its sawdust lay in the ground to mix and melt into the dust and bone you surely decayed into. Vernon's eyes remained closed, and the tune of the squeaks from the porch swing's chains continued. The only other sounds were the ice cubes melting and toppling into the now watered-down drink. Vernon's words of contempt for his deceased wife dribbled away quietly to a hush as a broken snore began to take the place of the venomous words that seconds ago dribbled from his mouth. Sawed-off chunks of the old dead tree lay in sporadic piles across his front lawn, scattered about from the violent carnage that just took place. It seemed a fitting metaphor today to the afternoon of carnage so long ago. An afternoon every bit as hot then as this one was today. At some point, Vernon must have awoken and gotten up from the swing, putting himself to bed, even though he retained no memory of doing so. He did, however, wrestle back and forth from one side to the other, unable to attain a position of comfort that would last long enough to get the deep sleep his body truly needed. His mind kept him busy in a stupor that resembled slumber. The memories hadn't left completely just because the hickory tree was non-existent anymore, having been vanquished by death from his property. Vernon's eyes began to twitch, first one and then the other in random waves. His breaths became heavy and full at times, then quieter and more labored at others. He was dreaming. But in his world, this was no dream at all. Instead, a recollection of the sins from his past. May had come back despite the actions brought on this afternoon with the help and efforts of Carl and his equipment. Efforts he had bought and paid for. Work was slow at the cabinet shop today. The heat was horrible. It had been for days. Humidity was heavy in the air, so swampy one felt like they were sucking salt water with every breath drawn. People became agitated and quick to ignite their fuse of bitterness because the temperature was not letting up. Even at home during an evening, the temperature still hung over them in the torrid lower 90s. Breaking points of anger grew from the frustration of the pattern that refused letting up. The Red River, just off Highway 91, was west of the Union Baptist Church and shrinking in its banks because of the lack of rain. This spot of land, which overlooked one of the narrowest parts of the winding waterway, is where Vernon and May settled their little homestead. The 10-acre plot of land with an old white-clappered 2-story farmhouse which sat in the middle of the acreage. Land Vernon purchased, so he would be a property-holding gentleman, a far better catch for a young girl back in those days than a wandering soul working as a temporary farmhand would be. Hell, Billy Hill, the man in question, could never afford to purchase and offer property to May. Not that he would have wanted to plant roots for long anyhow. He may have been a dark, handsome man with a chiseled chin and physique of a Greek god, although Vernon never saw it. He did, however, realize Billy would never amount to nothing as far as providing a vivacious woman like May anything of consequence. Nothing anything more than a tryst in the bedroom. May was a gorgeous treasure. She was far more valuable than just a naked fling-filled romp. A treasure Vernon was not ready to relinquish his aspirations of marrying her. Sure enough, though, he had seen May talking to Billy, and to him she appeared too close to succumbing to those sexual desires of that fucking gypsy who was only out to satisfy his own desires. On occasions, he did witness these flirtatious meetings of theirs, and it angered him deep down to his core. A hate he never knew he held inside. It heated him up far hotter than the temperature of the current sweltering heat wave. He wasn't going to allow Billy to taint the girl he soon held hopes of obtaining for a lifetime. Sweat and frustration grew within. He had put everything he owned on the line, and then a hefty loan note from the bank. He wasn't going to lose May and his life savings to any wandering bastard. He'd by God be marrying May. They were made for each other. Some stranger move-in type come into town and spoil his treasure? No fucking way. He'd kill him if need be. But it seemed May was in love with Vernon after all, just as much as he was in love with her. Billy moved on to some other town and Vernon and May married. Life was good. The money was good. The hours were long, but the cabinet shop kept the property payments to the bank on time, food on their table, and a little extra each payday for the savings account. Vernon was on track with his life's plan. May ended up working at the Union Baptist Church which wasn't a far walking distance from their new home. Her job wasn't out of necessity, it was from boredom. She wasn't meant to be just a housewife. Not until they had kids. Vernon hadn't ever been a Baptist before. Hell, he ain't ever been any religion at all. But May convinced him to come to church and see what he was missing. The two became regulars every Sunday, and it wasn't long before the preacher seemed to hit it off with Vernon. They became good friends and confidants. Vernon answered the Lord's call and became involved by volunteering to be a deacon. He enjoyed helping the preacher draw in new families to the flock. It gave him even more stature. He finally felt as if he were somebody in this world and making his mark, building his legacy. Maybe a child or two would be next. This is what life God chose to give us, a good living with fortune to boot. These were the feelings inside Vernon's thoughts, just rewards for living life in service to those less fortunate. Little did Vernon realize what life truly held for his future. As Vernon spent more and more hours away with preacher Tommy Gibson, his mentor, his time between work and churchin' left less and less for Vernon and May. What had started out a raging fire in their bedroom soon began its twist into a single smoldering coal about to choke to a staggering ember left in the cold night air. Their physical world together fizzled and burned out. What made it worse was the fact Vernon never saw it coming. Even though he had witnessed the spark she had shared with Billy back before he left those years back, he now took May for granted so badly that he never imagined what could take a calm summer's day and blindly usher it into a pop-up storm turned ravenous tornado. It was hot at the cabinet shop on the day Vernon's life began to change. Work was slowing down. People were having to spend their money in other ways than buying cabinets. Home sales suddenly plummeted, the heat draining not only their will to spend money, but their abilities to make as much. Prices soared while future inflation caused shadows of layoffs to hang overhead. The economy became tight about the time Gerald Ford took over for Nixon. Cash money became very tight in New York City, the financial heart of the country. It passed down quickly to people living in the country. Trust in the government became shattered with Nixon resigning under scrutiny and threat of impeachment. Southern Arkansas and the Red River was part of the country slower to feel the immediate struggle. But trouble was on the move and headed everywhere. The heat was on in more ways than just temperature. Vernon now faced a layoff of his own. He had just been told by his foreman, John Wilkie, to gather his personal belongings. Goddamned owner and president Olin Graham was too chicken shit to tell his employees. This set Vernon's mood off like a bull being stabbed at a bullfight. From the minute the word layoff stumbled and tripped across John Wilkie's lips, Vernon began his transformation into someone he himself didn't recognize. Why the fuck didn't Graham tell us this shit? Vernon demanded. I got a house and land payments to make. Fucking Graham owns land everywhere, cars, retreat home, and he's gonna lay me off and watch me lose everything while he's too big a pussy to tell me to my face? Bullshit! Vernon stormed out with clenched fists, turned a table saw over to the floor as he passed through the doorway to the parking lot. He wanted to go see Graham himself, face to face, let the prick know how this would hurt him and his wife. But somehow, through either fate or will, Vernon headed home. He couldn't wait to ask for Preacher Gibson's advice of how to handle things. And just as soon as he got home and changed out of his sweat-soaked t-shirt and jeans full of sawdust and grit from Graham's cabinet shop, he'd go to the church and consult him. He just hoped May wouldn't see the fear of losing everything that flushed his face and made him feel it was stamped into his eyes. Vernon felt rage. It wasn't the first time, but this was the harshest. Chapter 3. As Vernon pulled into his gravel drive and up the hill, he parked in front of the detached garage. The driver's side door swung open and he climbed out. His temper settled to a simmer as the door closed with a clunk. The side view mirror, which had begun to recently rattle, fell to the gravel when the door banged closed. He stopped and looked at it as the now cracked mirror shined a bright shattered reflection in his face as if to goad him with one more thing gone wrong on this miserable day. The indignation the mirror gave him pushed his anger back up, and he reached out and kicked the door of his 1969 gold Ford Galaxy 500 with a black vinyl top, a car he had been proud of the day he and May drove it off the lot. His rage had caused a large dent that would now need tended to. He suddenly remembered his job and source of income was now absent. God damn it! Vernon swiftly kicked the door again, increasing the indentation in depth. When he saw what he had done, he threw his closed fist onto the top with a deep resounding thud. He saw the top was now concave from his loss of control and the blood spilling from his fingers. He turned while his fist remained clutched as he stiffly walked toward the porch. He stopped just short of stepping up onto the first step. It was quiet. An odd hush seemed to fall over the entire yard. Not a single bird chirped, nor even the slightest of a breeze blow through the leaf-filled branches of the now large hickory tree in the yard. The hickory remained silent, as if Vernon's angered temperament would cause its broad trunk to shudder. And then a sound caught his attention. A distant sound, like maybe an animal groaning softly in pain, but then slightly overridden by the distant squeal of a tire on pavement. Vernon stopped and slowly turned 180 degrees, attempting to decipher where the sound was coming from. Vernon gazed out to the highway to see if a dog had been hit by a car. There had been several dumped dogs out his way, dumped by the damned townsfolk lately. The sound now grew to become small shrieks, followed by groans. He turned toward the screen door, sensing the sound was reverberating from inside. Muffled, but clearly not a sound emanating from the outside as he had surmised a mere 10 seconds earlier. Vernon slowly took the steps to the porch and reached for the screen door handle, dreading to pull it open, now suddenly leery of what he may stumble into inside. Quick reflection of the times he had seen May and Preacher Gibson share glimpses back and forth. He had seen what he imagined could be a look of lust between them. He loved Preacher Gibson so much that he avoided believing Gibson would betray him, especially in that unchristian way. Vernon knew when he and May were first married, he had been able to satisfy May's hunger for the flesh that he saw in her eyes, but now, after all these years, he now doubted himself. He had been busy with work, and May had remained busy churching with Preacher Gibson. Could it be possible the two could have been sneaking out together on the sly behind his and the preacher's wife? His stomach suddenly felt nauseous. Now, the thought of losing not only a wife and companion, but also his friend and mentor on this horrible day added to the mix brewing in Vernon's mind. Looky-loo now, what to do, entered his thoughts. Vernon slowly made his way to the closed French doors, the entrance to his and May's bedroom. He looked across the floor now, remembering the trail of clothes they had peeled from their bodies on their way to pleasure each other in the bedroom, to consummate their marriage and vows to each other those 15 years back. 45 years old now, his wife almost 10 years the younger. Had her hunger stayed potent while his suffered in virility? The room even looked different today. Not only the fact that there were clothes scattered around again that weren't his, but as he looked at his home, his mind wrestled with decisions needed to be made. The walls, now yellowed with age and smoke from the fireplace, used to warm the room in the harshness of winter, instead of the brand new white painted rooms when they crossed that same threshold all those years back. The furniture showing age, much like the wrinkles which turned his taut skin loose. The once empty room, now cluttered with trinkets neither one needed nor took notice of anymore. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror which hung above the fireplace mantel. He wasn't as young and handsome anymore, his clothes filthy from a job he no longer held. Big reddish-blue veins bulging from his temples from the pent-up anger this day had brought so far. Nasty sweat dripping from his pores and leaving trails in the sawdust still housed on his skin. Yes, life was different, and he hadn't even noticed the changes until this very second. Transformations that had crept past his perception because he was no longer focused on them. His desire for his precious May had somehow seemed to wane. He felt as if a ghost who owed him harm was hovering around him, scolding and pointing its all-knowing semi-transparent fingers at all the regularities time had brought change to. He felt something dark ahead of him. Very dark. His urge to turn away and leave met a call too strong to walk away from. Vernon slowly opened the door that would expose the source of the sounds of debauchery he had heard and proved to be what he had expected. The preacher's faith was not strong enough to resist the urge to fornicate with what Vernon swore was an angel. An age-old sin that could twist its way into any profession, even one of a man of cloth preaching salvation for all. What course of action should be taken? What reparation or penance should be collected? Today had already brought so much pain and fear of his future. His losses began to drum up a number inside his brain. His job, soon his home, the car, and now his wife. If he did what the ghost inside his mind told him to do, he would also need to chalk up his freedom. He'd surely go to jail even if it was a crime of passion. Time stood still as he quietly remained pondering before the crack in the door opened enough for all to be seen. Vernon quickly glanced around the room, trying to ignore the screams and moans of pleasure on the other side of that damn door between them as the opening became wider. The two cheaters still ignorant to his presence and the fact that he had been caught. Vernon instantly spied the hunting rifle on the rack above the television. It was always loaded and ready for protection against intrusion, and there was an intruder in his home, even if his wife didn't see it the way or share the same feelings about Gibson, his friend and preacher who was causing his mate to cry out in ecstasy. He turned once again back to the screen door he had quietly entered. The picture window displayed the sprawling pignut hickory tree with its branches, filling the view of the clear but dusty pane. Old Hickory appeared to be reaching out, trying to wave him from doing anything foolish, something that could never be taken back after being done. A trigger can't be unpulled past that click of death. Back and forth his head moved, from the tree limbs beckoning forgiveness to the rifle taunting his manhood and pride, and then back to the widening doorway where his mentor lay bawling his wife in an invasion of his trust. Chapter 4. Temptation can invade a man no matter what faith he clings to. Enticement to steal a man's wife or an inducement to kill him for it. Seldom is there ever a man who sees his life being quickly flushed down the shitter, that chose the high road and walks away from being wronged without attempting to right it. I suppose deep down to the marrow of the bone, the nitty of the gritty, Vernon never truly had a choice to make. It was all just a form of stalling and weighing out the reasons when he should have been planning his strategies of how and when to strike. When that door finally glided open enough to visualize the two fuckers who were wrapped together in their sweaty bodies, all tangled up and bumping their ugly parts together, eyes wide open with nowhere else to go except wider than a hoot owl stare, well, that's when the look of shock broke their pleasured smiles into one of fear and terror. Truth is, Vernon's eyes looked twice as shocked as theirs when he saw the man banging his wife wasn't his preacher after all. It was that fucking wandering gypsy Billy Hill. After all these years of being disappeared into obscurity, he had rode back to town to deflower Vernon's wife and spoil her goodies. It somehow certainly made Vernon's lack of guilt much easier to accept. After he drew a dead beat on Billy's forehead, he pulled the trigger, leaving a nice round hole in his sweaty head. Vernon felt comfort because he knew nobody round here would ever miss Billy a minute. Now May, on the other hand, he'd need to hold off on making her pay on the immediate. He was going to lay plans out on how that part of the restitution would play. She'd been staying down in the cellar with the other rats and varmints until he decided his course of action. He tied her up real good with wire and rope and duct tape across her pretty pitiful face. He'd applied that on the quick after she, of course, went to blaming Billy and trying to say he forced himself on her. Vernon wasn't always the brightest bulb in the room, but he also wasn't dimmest. Nah, May, you know they say it takes all kinds of people believe stupidity like believing that line of crap Well, it don't take all kind of people to do the crazy shit that you got caught doing. But the thing is, there are all kinds of people who will do just that, and you showed yourself as one of the willing kind to fuck another man other than the one you married and promised to love and cherish. I'm a willing soul too, just not one of the kinds to forgive your cheating ways. I know you'd say that's what the good Lord asks of me, but from what I've read in the Bible with Preacher Gibson... Vernon tightened the rope around her leg and looped it to the old discarded iron bed before he continued with a wicked smile. Jesus never took himself a wife during his short days spreading the word, so I reckon he can't speak of the experience of how one should react when their wife gets caught red-pussied cheating on him and then having balls enough to be asking to do something like forgive her. 'Cause he ain't never crossed that bridge I'm walking alone, and it's a long way down to forgiveness from where I'm looking. May tried to mumble to Vernon. Problem was, he'd already done something he couldn't undo, so now he was in a fix-it mode to make the problem disappear. There just weren't time to be haggling over sins already committed. He smiled at May as he turned to go back upstairs. Oh, I'll be back, May. That you can count on. As the last step creaked its final sound, the cellar door slapped closed, and along with the sound, almost every bit of light in the basement left along with it. There was nothing but the creepy, crawly sounds of pitter-pats across the concrete floor, varmints scampering around the boxes in bed, reclaiming their digs. Vernon put one body to rest that night, his arms sore from cutting Billy into pieces and putting them in buckets to take down to the Red River. He fed the catfish under the moon in quiet of the night. Nothing but the stars scattered overhead to watch him finish the chore. Vernon supposed May deserved to be interned differently. He'd chop her up and bury her parts around Old Hickory, the ever-growing tree that had seen so much of their lives, good and not so. Vernon did make a final decision on how to kill his wife, May. He settled on not making too much fanfare over it. He got up early the next morning and brewed himself a pot of coffee and made some toast and mint jelly, May's favorite. He sat on the porch swing, enjoying his breakfast and talking to the hickory branches that stretched toward the porch swing where he sat. May wasn't able to stick around and give me that child, the child I longed to see swinging from one of these limbs with a tire attached by a long rope. Breaks my heart how she just up and disappeared after I told her I got laid off. Said she couldn't bring a child into a marriage with money troubles. Said it wouldn't be Christian-like to bring a new life into poverty and struggle. Breaks my heart to have seen in her such sad spirits. Hard enough for me, but to watch the woman I promised to take care of all our lives, I'm afraid she's capable of self-inflicted harm. Vernon practiced his speech as if readying himself for a part in a school play until he had his lines down pat. When he was satisfied and had eaten the last crumb of toast and swallowed his last drink of coffee, he got up and walked inside, dropping his dishes off by the sink. His hand opened the door to the cellar, and he walked down into the darkness and picked up the sledgehammer as he walked by. The sound mimicking a melon being cracked open was the only noise made. The light so dim he wasn't even able to see the look of question or fear she may have worn. She didn't even mumble a plea of mercy, not seeing it coming. Vernon spent the day tidying up, taking care of the day's business, and then made a chicken salad sandwich along with a lemonade spiked with Old Granddad, his favorite. He took his lunch onto the porch swing and began rocking back and forth as he looked out over the freshly dug-up spots around the pignut hickory. He planted the pots of pretty colored flowers he had picked out several days earlier from the hardware store in town. He had hid them in the shed behind the garage. It was almost his and May's anniversary, and he wanted to give her something real pretty that they could put out in the yard and enjoy together, holding hands as they rocked on the swing, just like old times. He reckoned he now enjoyed the flowers a little more than she, as he picked up his whiskey sour and sipped. The ice cubes tumbled to his lips as he swallowed the sweet spiked lemonade. Chapter 5. The next day, when Vernon took his cup of coffee out to his swing, he dropped the cup to the wood-slat floor with a thud. He couldn't believe what he saw. There in front of him was the likeness of May in the bark of one of Old Hickory's protruding limbs. There was a huge knothole in the middle of May's head. Tree sap was running down over her face. He quickly looked around to make sure no one was there to see it. Vernon moved faster than he ever had before, headed to his tool shed to fetch his chainsaw. An hour and 20 minutes later, his woodpile for winter heat had grown considerably from the logs he had finished stacking. He sat down and began trying to come up with a plan to keep making his land payments and eat. Vernon had forgotten that he and May had each filled out life insurance policies. In case one would unexpectedly pass, life could continue once the grief subsided. Neither wanted the other to suffer losing their home or the ability to live, should tragedy strike the family. He smiled, suddenly feeling like at least that problem had been solved. In a couple of hours, he'd go see Preacher Gibson and begin playing the theatrical part of the concerned husband he had practiced. "Oh my God, Tommy, where could she have gone? I'm worried what she may do." He smiled an evil grin. The day went as planned, and Preacher Gibson and his wife were too upset and worried about May's disappearance. Vernon would have been a star had he been on Broadway. Vernon's day started out much like it did a lot of other mornings now that he was alone. There was an unexpected problem to his plan, it seemed. It frustrated the hell out of him, and he was getting weary and exhausted of having to amputate his wife's vestige regularly from the reaching limbs of Old Hickory. Every so often, there was a new growth in the tree's bark, the same image of his wife's head and torso, her head always with a knothole, which oozed tree sap from the opening. The cheatin' bitch was haunting him and keeping him from collecting his due money. How would he make his payments without it? He knew he couldn't leave the property for long anymore. Someone would see the goddamn tree and then he'd die in prison. Vernon's tree was beginning to appear sickly, and quite frankly, it was now butchered to a point it couldn't possibly survive if he had to keep removing branches every time May's likeness would appear. Preacher Gibson set up a fund in town to raise money to help poor Vernon. He was falling behind on his payments, and groceries were becoming sparser as he began to wither away himself. Sure, he had fooled the sheriff and everyone in town to believe that May must have either run off with someone else since he had lost his job, or possibly taken her own life. That part had worked to plan, but May was still winning, and he didn't understand why God was letting this happen. "I'm the one who worked 10 and 12-hour days and then go churching with Preacher Gibson till wee hours, bringing sheep into the fold. All May did was try to entice Preacher Gibson and then pleasure a passing hobo until I caught him in the act." Vernon screamed aloud from his porch to the now oddly trimmed hickory tree. People in town were beginning to talk about how old man Vernon was going crazy. People drove by and saw him standing on his porch pointing to the devastated hickory and sounding as if he were scolding and accusing it like it were human. Time passed, and one day out of nowhere, Vernon opened his mailbox with dread, knowing there was going to be another bill he would struggle paying. An answer to his problems came as assuredly as a miracle would. He opened an envelope from the New York Life and Casualty Company, and inside the envelope held a check for $350,000, the sum total of the benefit he had purchased, while a like amount was carried on him. For May, had things happened differently. The enclosed letter explained how the benefit had been overlooked when May disappeared, but now it had been 8 years, 1 year past the allotted waiting period to collect. He looked up at the tall, irregular trunk of Old Hickory, barely a limb protruding from its main body. Almost every branch had been surgically removed by his chainsaw because of May's reappearance showing up in the bark. He had trimmed a piece off here and there almost every week for the past 8 years, causing neighbors and passers-by to question the sanity of the old geezer that lived in the dilapidated farmhouse across from the Red River off Highway 91. Crazy Vernon, who yelled at a disappearing tree piece by piece. Vernon now felt vindicated. He had won in an odd kind of way. He had lost so much of his life and a woman he risked everything to obtain, but he had now found victory in the form of a rectangular piece of paper. A check. More money than he had worked his entire life for, but now so old and tired. Vernon stopped for a moment and looked around. Had he really won? His car had become a junker that barely ran. His home was falling apart around him. From the shingles badly needing replaced to the clapboard siding rotting underneath what little paint still covered it, Preacher Gibson had long since moved away, taking Vernon's short-lived faith with him. He was lonelier than he had ever been, and he had practically killed Old Hickory one limb at a time. It was time to put him to rest too. Vernon walked inside and picked up his phone. He dialed the number of an old friend he had once worked with at the cabinet shop many years ago. They, of course, hadn't talked regularly or kept up much with each other, but he knew he needed him today. "Hello, Carl?" Carl Kettner's truck pulled up the drive with a trailer behind it that carried a large stump grinder along with ladders and chainsaws. The next day, Vernon walked out on his porch and surveyed his yard. It was no longer shaded in any form by Old Hickory. The large sentinel was gone. Nothing but a pile of dirt that covered the base of the tree that had once watched Vernon's life start out with a healthy seed of love between two young lovers. The tree that saw newlyweds run from the car, the husband nabbing up his bride to carry her over the threshold of their new shared nest. The small sapling of that tree, which had almost tripped Vernon on his way in to lose his virginity to the hottest redhead the county ever knew. The same tree that grew quickly during some years when happiness spread out to its roots, and yet other years suffered stolen growth from weather and bitterness. Old Hickory witnessed it all, the worst being the event that changed everything. Vernon frantically running around digging holes for body parts here and there, covering them with the pretty anniversary flowers of every variety that he had secretly purchased and planned to hide until the special day. A day maybe May believed he had long forgotten forever. No one would ever know now. Old Hickory would never be able to tell him. Sadness overtook the anger and hurt in Vernon this morning. He slowly walked with his morning coffee out to the mound of dirt where Old Hickory once stood proud and firm. Vernon knelt to the mound and spoke softly. "I'm a broken man now, May. I promise you. I did love you. I don't know what happened in our life to bring us to this point. Hell, I don't know why I'm still here talking to a damn tree now that it no longer lives. I just don't feel very good today, and I don't want something to happen without letting you know that I forgive you and hope to God you forgive me." He began to brush the dirt to one side until he felt the strong grain of the wooden base that Old Hickory once was attached and stood firm. The stump felt odd, and Vernon began to brush away the dirt and sawdust more vigorously until he saw something he couldn't understand. He didn't believe the sight he was looking at. Vernon strained to remove his t-shirt and began brushing the soil from the center of the grinded down stump to the outer edges until he could clearly see the gift Old Hickory had given him. There, as large as life, ingrained within the wood, was an image of his beautiful May's face. A small hole near the edge of each eye dripped tiny streams of tree sap from each, forming living tears from May herself. "I love you, May. I haven't cashed a check from the insurance company, and I never will. It was never money I wanted from you. Never. It was always you. You were my angel." Vernon felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest, and he reached his hand to hold pressure to his heart. He looked back down at May's image etched into Old Hickory. After a sudden last gasp, he fell to the ground and his head rolled beside May's as a tear ran into his smiling lips. He looked at peace, finally. A likeness of Vernon's face began to appear from within the grain of Old Hickory as two tiny saplings popped from under the grass with a tiny leaf each. They were twisted together in a love knot and sprouted in unison to catch the sun's rays. A light breeze blew from the direction of the house, rolling a tiny sheet of paper from the porch and onto the grass, then rolled across the lawn until it caught on Vernon's finger. It was the check made payable to Vernon Hasker for the sum of $350,000. It clung to his wrinkled fingers until a stiff wind picked it up again and hurled it end over end toward the banks of the Red River, never to be claimed or seen again.
Chilling tales for dark nights.